Hello and welcome. The Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week's guest is Dr. Konrad Schmid, a professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the University of Zurich. In this episode, we chat about the historical and cultural context of the Hebrew Bible, its formation, the polytheistic to monotheistic transition, and its interactions with ancient Near Eastern empires, including Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, and the impact of Persian governance and tolerance on Hebrew thought and texts. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Great. Well, thank you for joining me, taking time out of your, I'm sure, busy schedule. And I know with time differences as well, it's later in the evening for you. So I'm happy that we could fit this in. So I just want to start and ask you, how did you get into your field? How did you get into ancient Judaism, Hebrew Bible stuff?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Yeah, I come actually from a family tradition. I'm a Swiss theologian, and my grandfather was a theologian. My father was even a Hebrew Bible professor. So it was a bit of I think, a matter of my ancestry that I became interested in the ancient world, and particularly ancient Israel, Judah, the Hebrew Bible. In high school, I learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, so I had the chance to study Akkadian, Ugaritic, Aramaic at the university. Meanwhile, my peers and friends and colleagues were learning Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So I became attracted to the ancient world, particularly the Hebrew Bible and its surroundings. It is a certain tradition here to study the Hebrew Bible at the University of Zurich in its historical environment and context. So that's what drove me into that field.
That's great. And then can I just probe a little deeper and say that it could be a very expansive, field of study. So was there something in particular that caught your attention and said, "Oh, I have more questions about this and I really want to know what's going on here"?
Yes, I think I was always interested in how people came to think the way they think. And I think particularly the long-term influences were interesting for me to discover. And therefore, I went into that field of Hebrew Bible because I think the Hebrew Bible is a text that witnesses to many of the developments that human thinking underwent in the first millennium BCE, and became very influential in the history of humanity, at least in some parts of the globe. And I may say that I'm probably most interested in the historical questions about the Hebrew Bible. So I would probably say my work can be best characterized as that of an intellectual historian. I'm also very much interested in the history of literature of the Hebrew Bible, and this literature of the Hebrew Bible was very much impacted by the ancient Near Eastern empires of the time, including ancient Persia.
Well, I'm just going to preview for the people listening to this episode. Our guest today was at Community Workshops 3 in Columbia. Some of our previous guests on this podcast participated in that conference, but I don't want to get there quite yet. So what I want to do is, even though that conference was really centered on Esther and Daniel, I wanted to ask, do you have any other books of interest outside of what we did in conference? We'll get to that later.
Okay. Yes, I think in the Hebrew Bible, my main interest is on the formation of the Pentateuch, that are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. This is very controversial, the Torah in ancient Judaism. How did these works come about? This is a century-long discussion which began in 19th century scholarship predominantly in Germany, but also in Great Britain and then also in the States. And I am among a group of scholars who entertains a new approach that is rooted in the 1970s and 80s and is more focusing on the different individual characteristics of the books of the Pentateuch. So this is something that I am very committed and interested in. But I also work on the prophetic books, particularly the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah, books that really were the object of rewriting, reinterpretation over centuries. I think one can really say that the Hebrew Bible looks like or can be compared to an ancient cathedral that was built over centuries. So many architects, constructors worked on that artwork, and therefore it's a very complicated piece of literature. And in order to unfold its richnesses and to understand what this complex literature is about, I think it's really imperative to entertain a historical approach to that kind of literature. It's, of course, the European tradition to do that, rooted very much in 19th century historicism of the German-speaking universities, but particularly when we are dealing with biblical literature, I think it's very enlightening to read that literature in a historical perspective.
Well, this gets my brain going in for so many different reasons. So just, I mean, I think I've mentioned it on the show a few times, so the audience may know what I'm gonna say before I do. But so I grew up in a very secular Jewish family, and so I got a choice, and my parents said, "Do you want to do bat mitzvah? Do you want to go learn about religion, do this traditional rite of passage?" And what child? And I usually say, well, what kid at 9, 10, whatever age you start thinking about going says, yeah, I really want to spend my Saturdays or Sundays going in and doing this rather than hanging out with friends. So I elected not to. And so I kind of just skipped reading anything related to it. And so I had to come back to it as an adult, as a scholar, and say, okay, wait, I haven't engaged with Hebrew Bible. Maybe that's bad for my overall knowledge of antiquity. And so one thing I wanted to kind of bring up from your last answer was you talked about being interested in for first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Pentateuch, or, as we would say, especially Torah. And you mentioned that it was complicated. And I want to get into that a little bit because as someone who had to come to it later, and still I haven't done a deep reading or anything, but I have to touch on it every once in a while. From a person who's not very well versed in reading any of these religious texts, my impression is that the portrayal of God, in especially the first 5 books, is super contrary to this very sanitized modern version that you get, especially from the later books and from like my conversations with like Catholic friends and stuff. But the impression I got is, oh, he seems kind of vengeful. He seems almost kind of like the gods from the mythologies of some of these other ancient cultures. You look at the Greek gods, you look at some of these other places around the region, you go, oh yeah, kind of Old Testament God feels like that, not this benevolent power that just sort of loves everybody that they like to tell us about now. And so thinking about cross-cultural influences and other things, my impression is that, yeah, Old Testament God is kind of like some of these other ancient culture ideas about deities. And so one of the things I would like to ask really is how far off is this impression that I have from coming back to it? Is this one of the things that is kind of complicated when you look at the first 5 books versus the later Bible? Like, where does this all come into play?
Yeah, Thank you so much. These are, of course, very interesting and wide-ranging questions. Before I answer, please allow me to quickly mention a book that I published together with a colleague from the University of Berlin, The Making of the Bible. It was published in 2022 with Harvard University Press, and it gives you a full sketch. But just to answer quickly here, I think in order to approach the Torah, the Pentateuch, in a historical perspective, one very basic distinction is very crucial. And this is the distinction between the world of the narrative and the world of the narrative. And the world of the narrator. So the world of the narrative is the second millennium BCE, Moses, Exodus, the ancestors and their wives and so on, Joseph in Egypt. And the world of the narrative does not coincide with the world of the narrative. The world of the narrator does not coincide with the world of the narrative. The world of the narrator is somewhat later. We know this because the development of a scribal culture in ancient Israel and Judah only begins in the 9th, 8th century to develop to such a degree that larger pieces of literature really can be written in order to produce literature that is as extensive as, say, the Moses story or the Jacob cycle and so on. You really need to have skilled scribes and so on. And these skilled scribes, they need a training. And in order to be trained, you need to have a certain level of developed statehood. And this we know particularly from ancient Near Eastern parallel sources. This is the case for the northern kingdom Israel starting from the 9th century BCE, and for Judah starting from the 8th century BCE. And therefore, we can be actually quite sure that what we read in the Torah is not just somehow an eyewitness report of the time where the scenery plays out of all these stories, but that these are texts that were written later on down, and that they much more reflect the period when they were written down than when they play out. And I think this is important to understand this literature historically, and particularly with regard to the notion of God in the Torah. We can see that the Torah basically, not exclusively, but basically portrays a monotheistic God. There is just one God. This one God creates the world. He brings the flood. He rescues Noah and his clan out of the flood. He leads Israel out of Egypt. It's just one God. But the Bible, also the Torah, knows that this God has a proper name, the Tetragrammaton, and a god only needs a name if there are other gods around. So I think the Bible still somehow witnesses to the fact that it was, or its stories, not the written stories, but the written stories maybe as well, but predominantly the oral stories, that they came from an environment, a religious environment that was basically polytheistic. And this is what we know from the ancient cultures in Mesopotamia and also in Egypt, but also from the small states in the Levant, particularly in the southern Levant. Each state has had its own god. So Ammon, Moab, Edom, Israel, Judah. There was one national deity, and this is probably the birthplace of the biblical God, who only in the 6th, 5th century BCE then finally ascended to be the one creator deity, who then also just simply could be called God, Elohim in Hebrew, which denotes the very category of gods. And there can be no doubt that the Bible is deeply influenced by ancient Near Eastern materials. So we know today that the creation story reflects the Babylonian creation myth. It really takes the material up and reinterprets that Babylonian creation epic. Genesis 1 is probably a text that was written in the Babylonian exile when the Judeans had been deported into Babylonia. So it's a 6th century BCE text. And we also know that the flood story is not something that is genuine to the Bible. The flood story is much older. We know Sumerian and Old Babylonian, New Babylonian versions of it. And it's also very likely that the Bible knew these Babylonian versions of the flood story and took it up and interpreted in a monotheistic way, which still can be seen today in the biblical flood story. So actually, it doesn't make a lot of sense if you read the story that there is a deity who wants to destroy the creation or the world he created, and then he nevertheless somehow hampers this plan by saving the hero Noah and his family out of it. So you still can sense that apparently in the original story, as we know now from the Babylonian versions of that story, that different deities had been involved in that flood story, which are now merged into one deity, the biblical creator deity. So what we can see is basically that the biblical traditions in the Pentateuch, they are not original or innovative in terms of the material that they portray, but they are original and innovative in how they receive, how they own, how they take up, how they reinterpret these ancient Near Eastern traditions, and somehow they condense it towards their own deity, the biblical creator God.
I love that answer because it makes me think about it in a new way that makes me almost appreciate it more because I think that I will preface this and say, being in the States, it's a very different experience growing up here and then having so many different communities and interpret the Bible in so many different ways. But so I never really paid it attention. But your answer is interesting because it's getting me to think about like the Bible, if we look at it through a very specific lens, of course, not everyone will do this, but thinking about the Bible itself, especially the first 5 books, as essentially reception, rather than, kind of treating it as, no, I mean, it is its own original work because it's reception of ideas, but just looking at it that way, as opposed to some of the attitudes I feel like I've encountered here in the States, puts a really interesting spin on it. And then that further gets me thinking, well, okay, the flood narrative I did know, yeah, that's not unique. They're Babylonian flood, as you've just mentioned. But it does get me thinking about, as someone who studies this, what is, for anyone curious, what is something that, like a narrative, something that happens that we can pick out of the Bible that we sort of attribute as, no, this is unique to it. This is special. This is its own thing. Yeah. What's something that we kind of think of as, no, this is biblical for sure. That's not actually, but that is in itself reception of something else separate from the flood. We've already mentioned that, but I'm just curious because I think, talking to people, depending on how you're taught, depending on what you learn, you'll learn to associate something with it that maybe it really isn't. And I've heard a lot of people talk about, especially working here at UCLA, how, oh yes, the Bible is interesting for X, Y, Z, but this was very much influenced by, and I've heard people go, wait, really? Where did you get that? So yeah, I'm just curious, like what's something maybe we associate that's super biblical that is not originally?
Yeah, I think first of all, let me go to the beginning of your question. I think one needs to be aware that when the Bible was written in the first millennium BCE, the religion of ancient Israel and Judah was not a book religion. It was a cult religion. It was centered around the sacrifices at the different sanctuaries. And the cult then eventually in the 7th century was centralized in Jerusalem. But I think we have to free ourselves from the impression that ancient Israel and Judah always somehow were centered on holy scriptures. This is actually a process that developed over centuries and was particularly catalyzed by the temple destructions in 587 BCE by the Neo-Babylonians and in the year 70 CE by the Romans. Only when, so to speak, the sanctuary, the temple was lost, there was a transition towards a book religion, and only after 70 CE, when the Romans had destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem, the Bible really became the center of the religion. And this is also the 1st century CE is also the historical point where the theory of inspiration finally somehow was generated in order to secure the holiness of these scriptures. Many of the scriptures of the Bible were, or let me put it even more drastically, no book of the Bible was conceived as a book of the Bible. The Bible is, so to speak, an anachronistic term for the literature that we now know as Bible. So to ascribe religious authority and sacredness and so on to these texts and books, this is an act of the reception of these books and not an act of the production of these books. But to come to the main point that you were asking, what is actually genuine or original or unique about the Bible? I think there are many things that are unique about the Bible. I would say I would mainly point out maybe this point. The religion of ancient Israel and Judah is the only ancient Near Eastern religion that is still alive today, in the shape of Judaism, in a transformed shape in Christianity, in a transformed shape in Islam. All the other religions, the Egyptian religion, the Moabite religion, the Edomite religion, the Mesopotamian religions, they all no longer exist. And one can ask why. Why is actually Judaism the religion that is still alive and practiced today? And I think the main reason why this is the case is that in ancient Israel and Judah, the believers of that religion, they were able to conceive of God in a very complex way. So they thought of God as a deity that is not only guaranteeing the prosperity of its believers, but it's a deity which also can, in certain phases of history, act against its own people, against their own king, against their own temple, against their own people. And somehow, by figuring out such a complex concept of religion, I think to conceive of one God who is doing good things to his people, but who can also act, at least from a human perspective, in a destructive way towards his own people. I think this made this religion so resilient that it could survive over the centuries and somehow provided differentiated enough notion of their deity, which still seems to be attractive to many believers also today.
Yeah, yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, and it is quite incredible to think about the long development from antiquity to modernity, what sticks, what doesn't, in more or less. Yeah, it's the form that it came into being without being dramatically changed. So, yeah. Well, I'm going to sit with that one because that was a lot to think about. So, what I'm going to do while I stew on that is I'm going to ask you about ACWorks 3. So, for our audience, I'm just going to reiterate we had this conference in February of 2025, Achaemenid Workshops 3, on sort of the literary history of the Achaemenid Empire. And we had several fantastic papers and panels. And I would love if you could tell our audience what you presented on.
Yeah, it was a great workshop, really interesting also for me. I learned a lot. I think from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, it's first really important to say that the Hebrew Bible, in a historical perspective, is an ancient Near Eastern book. Ancient Israel and Judah, these are two small political entities that somewhere developed in the first millennium BCE. And the southern Levant, where Israel and Judah are located, this was always in between the much older, the much greater, the much more powerful ancient Near Eastern empires of ancient Egypt on the one hand, and Mesopotamia, and also Persia on the other hand. I think it's not something that you should wonder about, that whatever was written, what was thought in ancient Israel and Judah was deeply influenced by these much older, much bigger civilizations to the west and to the east of ancient Israel and Judah. And therefore, I think we can really say that most of the theological, ideological, political positions that we can read in the Hebrew Bible, that they are interacting with concepts, political, theological concepts that are known either from Egypt or, much more important, from Mesopotamia and ancient Persia. I would say from the 9th to the 7th century, it was mainly the interaction with Neo-Assyrian concepts that determined biblical viewpoints, because in the 9th and to 7th century BC, the Assyrians were the predominant power in the ancient Near East. In the 6th or say 7th and 6th century, it was the Neo-Babylonians who brought the Neo-Assyrian Empire to a fall. And then from 539 onwards, this is the date of Cyrus the Great's conquest of Babylon, until the time of Alexander the Great, so 333 and 331 BCE, the big battles at Gaugamela and Issos, who ended the Persian predominance in the ancient Near East. So from the 6th to the 4th century, the Persians were the main culture that the Hebrew Bible was interacting with. And we can still see in the Hebrew Bible, and this was one of my contributions, that the reaction towards Persia in the Hebrew Bible predominantly is positive. So this is quite astonishing. So when I went to high school in Switzerland, we learned in our Greek lessons, the Greeks, they are the good guys, and the Persians, they are the bad ones, predominantly because the Persians fought against the Greeks. But from a biblical perspective, it's actually the other way around. The Persians were very well liked in the provinces of Israel and Judah, and this was basically based on the fact that the Persians had a very tolerant way of interacting with subdued people and nations that they had conquered. This is not something like early humanism avant la lettre with a lot of tolerance in a theoretical concept, but it was probably a sheer political necessity to reign this huge empire, so that the Persians thought the best way to handle this humongous empire is really to accord as much local power to the local entities as they can. And this was, of course, very welcome. So the Persian kings of the Achaemenid period, they thought of themselves as those who restored the local sanctuaries, who gave the local nations their legal autonomy, and so on. And I think this was, at least in parts, very well received in the realm, in the geographical realm of Israel and ancient Judah, because you can see that in the Hebrew Bible, if you read particularly the prophetic oracles against the nations, you can see that nearly every nation gets an oracle of judgment and doom, except for the Persians. The Persians, they are never somehow the object of hatred or of divine judgment. And I think this is a reflex on the very liberal or tolerant way how the Persians handled their empire. There were, however, also other strands in the provinces of ancient Israel and Judah that thought, no, if there is foreign great king like the Persian great king, if Israel is still in the diaspora, if we are not all reunited in the homeland, this is still a period of judgment. And they were actually opposing also the Persian dominance over the Levant. But I think the major voices, particularly the priests, they were actually quite happy with the Persian Empire. For them, to use a modern anachronistic term, for them it was, so to speak, the end of history. The end of history. The Persian Empire was the way how they thought God meant his creation to be. One can see this particularly in chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, where you have this table of nations, the 70 nations that repopulate the globe after the big flood. And this is a description of the world that is basically diversified and pluralistic, and that shows that these biblical authors basically adapted the Persian worldview of the Achaemenid Empire, that every nation could somehow be in their own place with their own religion, their own culture, their own language, and that this was basically the divine will. This is a very extraordinary chapter. It's a little bit boring to read, but if you look at the theological or the political concept of that chapter, you can see that it's really a very revolutionary view of how the world should be organized and what the divine will behind that could be.
Yeah, well, I've been trying to force my brain to think back to the conference, and I'm trying to pull out things that I think I remember from your talk a little bit that I just found super interesting as well that relates to all this. And so I'm gonna at any time stop me if I'm misremembering some of the things you touched on in your talk, because I don't want to go down a wrong rabbit hole. But one of the things that I want to pick up on is, yeah, this idea of how some people actually didn't mind the Persians. They have this reputation. They're a little more tolerant, like it's life is okay. But if I remember, yeah, picking up on this the strand where some people were like, no, I don't really want the Persian great king. If I remember, you I think talked a little about, touched on, dove into this idea of opposition to Achaemenid rule because it was an argument for like an ancient form of national sovereignty. And I think I picked up on that because I did political science for my master's. And so I went, oh, this is great. So I remember, I think I like wrote that word, just the word down because I didn't want to detract too much from the talk. So I have a note somewhere that says national sovereignty. And I did want to ask because I had to write a paper during my master's. It was for a class talking about sort of like ancient borderlands and this idea of sovereignty. And I think I cited ancient Israel as kind of this example for, oh, well, based on kind of how the people, the religion, the ideas had been set up, like they would be one of, I think I said, two or three really great ancient cases for actually being their own, considered their own separate ancient like nation state. I'm wondering if you could just bring that up a little bit and talk a little bit more about the case for national sovereignty for Israel and the opposition to Achaemenid rule.
Yeah, I think maybe it's helpful really to go back a little bit in the history of ancient Israel. The biblical God is the God of Israel, of a specific ethnic entity, of a specific nations. And in the world of the ancient Near East, the natural way of organizing the political administration of a nation or a people was a monarchy. So the king is really the central figure in the political thinking, in the theological thinking of a nation. So it's really quite a big thing of the priests to say, Yeah, we don't care if there is a Persian great king as long as we can have our temple, our cult, our religion, our language, and so on. But this, brings me back to what I said earlier in the talk. This belongs to the innovations of the Israelite religions in the exile, that they were able somehow to make a certain abstraction from this very local nationalistic institution of their own kingship, that they said, no, God is also free to choose other kings, foreign kings that actually do not know him, as his tool. And some of the biblical writers, particularly in a section of the book of Isaiah that we call Deutero-Isaiah, in Isaiah 45, these authors, they wrote about Cyrus, the king of Persia, as the Messiah of God. So we really have the term Mashiach in Hebrew here. So he is the anointed one, which is a prerogative of the Davidic kings. So these priests really made that step. But on the other hand, there was this group that we now call, with a very artificial term, Deuteronomists, because they are more or less in this thinking strand that resembles the theology of the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomists, they were convinced, no, we need a Davidic king. Without a Davidic king, the restoration after the exile cannot be complete, and accepting a foreign king who might be chosen unwittingly by God to serve as his tool, this is not enough. There we expect really another act in history, another intervention, another divine intervention of God in history, first to establish his kingship, his Davidic kingship in Israel again, and also to bring back the diaspora. But as we know of today, this Deuteronomistic strand, they had to adapt to the historical realities. There is still a Jewish diaspora all over the globe today. And we also don't have a restoration of a Davidic kingship. And I think it's quite interesting to see that in 1948, when the modern state of Israel was created, it was completely clear that it had to be a democracy and not a new monarchy. There were some very tiny splinter groups who said, now it's time to restore the Davidic dynasty and so on. But it could really be neglected. I think this shows that this priestly tradition that Judaism can adapt to foreign powers as long as, so to speak, Torah life is possible for Jews all over the world, that then, so to speak, the importance of who is actually in charge in terms of political rule, that this can become an issue of secondary significance.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I did kind of remember, and I was looking around for some of my notes if I could find any that I took from that conference, and I did find one that I also jotted down, just like the very basic idea. And I'm so happy I found this note that I wrote to myself, because yeah, this idea that okay, it's kind of malleable as long as, our language, our religion, our practices are maintained. Yeah, okay, we can make it work. Because this idea of the note to myself just says Persian kings, tools of God of Israel. Because I don't remember exactly how it went in the talk, but I wrote that down as something like, oh my goodness. Because that was a big one for me. I was like, wait, okay, so obviously we still don't have a Davidic king, but
Yeah.
yeah, bringing that idea in, I was like, okay, so obviously some people, as you've just established, were like, no, we really actually need a Davidic king. But yeah, this idea that, yeah, they would be cool with the Persian great king because, oh, well, he's a tool. I mean, maybe he's not the most willing. Maybe he's not like just on it the way they need him to be. But this idea that he could be is
Yeah.
really interesting because, I mean, would the Persian king have considered himself that way as well?
Yes, I think we know that. For example, from the Cyrus cylinder, this is a very famous inscription from around 539 BCE. And there, so to speak, Cyrus presents himself as the one who was commissioned by Marduk, who is a Babylonian, not a Persian deity. So Cyrus himself interpreted himself as a tool of the deities of the nations that he conquered. So Israel and Judah was too small, too little, in order to expect that Cyrus would have reflected that explicitly. But in this second part of the book of Isaiah, starting from chapter 40, which belongs to the Babylonian and the Persian period, we can see that apparently the Judean scribes in the exile adopted this theology of the Cyrus cylinder and transferred it to their own situation. And they said, no, Cyrus is not only a tool of Marduk, he is also a tool of the God of Israel. And there is a certain discussion. One can read that in chapter 45 of the book of Isaiah. Some elder texts, earlier texts that are contemporaneous with Cyrus, they say that God took Cyrus by his hand, by God's hand, without that Cyrus knew it. So this is one perspective, but you also have a second perspective that what's later on added, in order that you, Cyrus, can see that I am God. And this idea that a foreign emperor recognizes the God of Israel as the universal God, this has become a topic then in the Hebrew Bible, also on a larger scale. Maybe this idea also, is able to remember the figure of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, who also somehow is forced to acknowledge the biblical God as the one God who is in charge. And this is probably also a concept that is probably, or that reflects this Persian situation. One can, I think, also see that this universalistic tendency that the biblical God can use foreign emperors as his tools, that this also has some impact on how the Hebrew Bible conceived the notion of God. After all, I said earlier in the talk that the Hebrew Bible predominantly in its current shape is monotheistic. So the Hebrew Bible basically just knows of one deity. There are occasional mentionings of other deities, so that one can see there is still some memory of earlier historical situations of the religious history, but otherwise it's fairly monotheistic. But in terms of somehow talking about monotheism, it's really crucial to distinguish between two elementary forms of monotheism. Monotheism is not just monotheism, but there are two specific versions of it. The one monotheism that we usually would associate with the term is this exclusive monotheism. An exclusive monotheism says, my God is the only God that exists. Your gods, these are just illusions. These are idols. So these are they are completely in vain. This is the exclusive notions. We have that also in the Bible. This is more the Deuteronomistic strand that I mentioned earlier. But besides the exclusive notion of monotheism, there are also inclusive versions of monotheism. And inclusive versions of monotheism, they claim there is only one God, but different nations, different people can venerate him by different names. And this is the monotheism that we have in many priestly texts of the Pentateuch, predominantly in Genesis 1. The author of Genesis 1 knows that the biblical God has a name. Nevertheless, he just speaks of God who created heaven and earth. And this is an implicit, inclusive notion of monotheism. I think this text, Genesis 1, which probably originates from the either late 6th or early 5th century BC, the author of this text somehow wanted to show the awareness that, of course, we believe that our God, the God of Israel, is the creator deity. But we somehow acknowledge that other people might use other names in order to identify this creator deity. So the Persians might call him Ahura Mazda, the Greeks might call him Zeus, the Egyptians might call him Ra, the Babylonians might call him Marduk. But in order to show this inclusive awareness, they just chose this term God. And this was a revolution, so to speak, in religious language that is still active today all over the world in different religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and also other religions. People, if they pray to God, they don't use a proper name for God, but they use the term God. So this inclusive notion that they just use the term for the category of gods, of deities, so that you can see that apparently this way of speaking of God really has become this way of speaking of God that Genesis 1 introduced, that this has become of really major historical significance that still can be sensed today.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating and I so appreciate getting to hear you talk about it again because I remember coming out of your talk in New York, I thought, "Oh, I'd love to go into this, just hear a little more." And so I'm happy to say I've been able to do that and then recreate that for other people who would be interested in hearing about this as well. So one thing I did want to sort of ask here is, say we could create another conference that's kind of looking, in this interdisciplinary vein, right, at cultural influences and how, the influence of other Near Eastern cultures affected Hebrew Bible and stuff. So if you could, pull together part two, let's just say, of, this conference part two, what would you like to see focused, like the focus of it be?
Yeah, I think the conference was really interesting and eye-opening at Columbia University. But I recall the final discussion of the conference when we asked, is there really cross-cultural influence all over? So we had contributions covering Egypt, Greece, ancient Israel, the Arameans, ancient Persia, Babylonia, and so on. And if we somehow really were serious with ourselves and somehow applied quite strong criteria, the really identifiable cross-cultural contacts were not too numerous. So we had the Bizitun inscription that we have on the one hand in the Zagros Mountains, and that was also found in an Aramaic translation in ancient Egypt. We had Achikar, that was an influential work in various regions, and there were other individual contacts. But I think it is fair to say that we basically had to admit the big one, so to speak, intellectual or literary melting pot, this was not discernible. So for a follow-up workshop or conference, one idea might be really somehow to start where we ended with the New York workshop and really try to find out how can we further engage with these contacts that we identify? How can we clarify what went on in terms of cross-cultural exchange here? And can we also find explanation why these specific texts were important for cross-cultural reference? And can we find explanations why other texts simply remained of local significance? And I think one really could try to take into account different venues or avenues of research here. So to ask, on the one hand, on the literary level, what can we observe, but also on the material level and on the sociological, on the geographical level, what were actually the vectors, the trajectories of transmissions that we can identify? How did cultural exchange between different regions of the Achaemenid Empire really work? How can we imagine of these processes in a historically illustrated and comprehensible way? So this might be an option in order to continue.
Yeah, I think that'd be really fascinating, really interesting, and maybe one day it will happen. Maybe someone out there is listening to this and will say, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it, part two." So, oh man, this morning's conversation has been so great because there's so much that my brain wants to chew on, which I hope that it will do for the rest of the day. And I hope that for people listening, their brains are also kind of going and will be thinking about any one of the many things that we've been talking about this, well, morning for me. So what I'm going to do though, unfortunately, because if I asked you more questions, I do fear that we would be here for 5 hours because I could easily do that. So to save myself, yourself, people from hearing me ask you questions for the next several hours, I'm going to pivot us to, I have two questions I normally ask at the end of our podcasts. And I open this up because obviously not everyone does strictly Iranian studies. So I say, please think about and answer this from whatever perspective you would like, whatever interdisciplinary way you need to do it. So,
interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
the first of these questions is, what, in your opinion, is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Yeah, the greatest legacy of ancient Persia, I think, and of course, I'm here influenced by the biblical perspective on ancient Persia. I think the biggest legacy is this idea that the world does not have to be linguistically, religiously, culturally uniform. I think the Persian Empire, at least to my knowledge, is the first empire in human history that somehow acknowledges and fosters diversity and pluralism. This goes as far as that the Persian Empire didn't have a central legislation, but apparently they allowed the different subdued people to live according to their own laws, to their ancestral laws. And I think this is, of course, on the one hand, a very pragmatical, but on the other hand, also a very wise and sustainable way of somehow living together. I can maybe also say that I'm maybe influenced here by my Swiss perspective. Switzerland is also a very diverse country. We are not held together by one language. We speak German, French, and Italian. We are also not an ethnic unity. Our people have completely different pedigrees. And so we had to develop a political system that is very much diversified and takes into account how to handle minorities. And I think the Persian Empire is a first, of course, an ancient. I don't want somehow to glorify that, but it's an ancient blueprint of how to live in a pluriform way in a human society.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, I like it when scholars bring their own sort of background and perspective to it because I do think it adds something special. So I like that answer. The second question, again, answered however you wish, is What do you think would be the best legacy that we as current scholars can leave for future students of Iranian studies in the adjacent fields?
Yeah, I think, and here maybe I also speak from my European perspective. I think UCLA is a great place to do Iranian studies, to do Iranology, and I really admire your place, what you achieve, what you do, what kind of expertises you're able to draw, and what you bring together at UCLA. Here in Switzerland, we are a small country, so our population is less than 10% of California. There is not a single professorship in Iranian studies. In Germany, there are a few posts, but I think it's also underrepresented. So I think what we here in Europe should do is, so to speak up to have Iranology and Iranian studies really be part of what we think is, so to speak, just the basic set of disciplines that we deal with in a comprehensive university. And of course, I know that all universities have limited funds and that there are disciplines like political studies, psychology that are flooded with students. But the idea of a university is to deal with everything that humans created that is relevant for our history, for our self-understanding. And I think Persia, the ancient Iranians, also modern Iranians, that is really crucial to understand in order to get a more complete view of what shaped us as humans then and now.
That's a great answer as well, because the humanities they should be well-rounded and we should include everyone because world history is for everybody. So I couldn't agree more. And okay, there is one more question I'm going to ask you, but it's very easy, I promise. And that is, if people are interested in finding your work, your books, or even emailing you to ask a question, or even emailing you to ask to come study in Switzerland, where can people find you?
They just can Google me. So Konrad Schmid, you find my email address, my website, my publications, also whatever is open access available. So yes, and I'm of course happy to get in contact with whomever is interested in my work or would have questions regarding this talk or other pieces that I have written.
Great. Well, I will attempt to link your faculty page into the show notes, and then some of the publications you mentioned, I'll try to find links to them and put them there as well. So that way people can just easily click in and find whatever they wish. So with that, I really just want to thank you for taking the time out of your evening and coming and talking to me. And yeah, I hope that, maybe you'll come to UCLA at some point, maybe not in the next 3 years, but at some point to come and see colleagues here. And otherwise, yeah.
Thank you so much, Lexi, for having me. It was fun, interesting, and a great opportunity for me. Thanks.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.